The mud remembered everything. Sergeant Elias Voss had been in the Ardennes long enough to know that. It remembered the boots of German conscripts who had marched through in 12, nervous about a war that smelled like it was coming. It remembered the hooves of Belgian cavalry horses. It remembered the first frost of November 1913, when the sky above the Schwarzwald cracked open like a shell casing, and something fell out of it. Something that was not a meteor, that did not behave like any ordnance Voss had ever seen, that hit the earth with a sound he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who had not been there. He usually settled on this. Imagine a cathedral bell, but fill it with the sea. Then the machines came out of the crater, and after that, the words stopped mattering. Voss had been 26 years old in the autumn of 1913, serving with the 27th Infantry Division out of Stuttgart, a lean and unremarkable sergeant whose principal talents were map reading, keeping his boots dry, and knowing, at a cellular level, when something was about to go badly wrong. He had possessed this last quality since childhood. His mother called it the crow sense, the feeling that made you look up before the branch fell. The crow sense had saved him twice in training accidents and once from a collapsing mine shaft in Lorraine, where he'd pulled 2 other men clear by the collars of their coats before the ceiling came in. In October 1913, the crow sense was screaming. The first reports from the Schwarzwald were classified before anyone outside the region had a chance to hear them properly.
Munitions accident,
said the official communiqué. An unfortunate industrial incident in a remote forested area. No civilian casualties. Investigation ongoing. The kind of language that meant, we do not know what this is and we are frightened. Voss's unit was mobilized within the week. They rode southeast in the back of a lorry past villages that were quiet in the wrong way. The way a forest goes quiet before a storm. Every bird lifting off at once as if sharing a single thought. Farmers had abandoned fields mid-furrow. A child's shoe sat in the middle of a road with no child attached to it. By the time they reached the edge of the impact zone, the trees had been flattened in a ring 2 kilometers wide. Not burned, not blown. Flattened, the way you might press flowers between the pages of a book, each trunk bowed outward from a common center, a sunburst of ruined timber, and in the middle of it all, a depression in the earth that steamed.
Artillery?
Said Corporal Brenner beside him. Voss looked at the shape of the flattening, at the angle of the fallen trees, at the color of the steam which was faintly blue at its edges like a gas flame turned low. No, he said, he was right. They had 40 minutes to confirm it before the herons walked out of the steam and the world changed. No one was prepared for the scale of them. Voss had read Jules Verne as a boy, had seen the theatrical illustrations in the magazines, had a passing familiarity with the Wells novel that had so frightened London in 1898. A story that most educated Europeans treated with the affectionate condescension reserved for a good ghost story. None of it prepared any of them for the first heron, moving at full stride through what had been a pine forest, the canopy not slowing it, not touching it, the trunk simply bending aside and snapping under the pressure of its passing, the way wheat bends under the hand of someone moving through a field. 130 feet tall, perhaps more. It was difficult to judge in the first moments, because the mind refused to cooperate, refused to accept the scale, kept trying to reframe what it was seeing as something smaller and more manageable. The legs were 3 in number, jointed in 3 places each, terminating in splayed feet that distributed the weight across a broad impression in the earth. And they moved with an unhurried mechanical grace that was somehow the most horrifying thing about the creature, that it was not rushing, that it had nowhere urgent to be, that it was simply walking the way you or I might walk across a courtyard in the morning. The heat ray came without warning. One moment there were 80 men in the clearing ahead of Voss's position. The next moment there was a white-blue brilliance, a sound like the air itself being torn, and then nothing, not even smoke. Just the smell of ozone and scorched earth and a silence so total it felt physical, like a change in air pressure. Voss did not run. He understood, with the crow sense operating at a frequency he had never felt before, that running was death, that the machine's sensory apparatus, whatever it was, responded to movement, to the scatter pattern of panicking men. He lay flat in the ditch where he dropped at the first flash, and pressed his face into the mud, and breathed through his mouth, and listened to the footsteps of the heron, receding, 3 beats at a time, unhurried, a vast metronome counting off the seconds of a world that had ended and not yet admitted it. He waited 3 hours before he moved. It was the longest 3 hours of his life, and he spent every minute of them listening, memorizing, cataloging. The way the feet sounded, the interval between steps, the change in sound quality when the machine stopped, a slight deepening hum that seemed to travel through the ground into his sternum. The behavior of the smaller machines, the ones that came behind the herons like pilot fish behind a shark, the ones they would later call spiders, scuttling across the ruined earth with a rapid clicking efficiency that was somehow worse than the heron's grandeur. Because it was too fast, too purposeful, too uncannily alive. He noticed that the spiders stopped when the heron stopped. He noticed that when the heron turned its attention to something, a cluster of fleeing soldiers, a burning farmhouse, the spitters turned also, oriented in perfect synchrony like iron filings around a magnet. Connected, he thought, subordinate. The heron is thinking. The spiders are its hands. He filed this away and lay in the mud and waited and survived. By December 1913, the Martians. The name had solidified in the popular press within weeks. No other word having the right weight. Controlled a front stretching from the lowlands of Belgium to the Swiss border. The Allied High Command, composed of French, British, Belgian, and German officers, who had set aside 3 decades of mutual suspicion in the space of a fortnight, established its headquarters in a requisitioned chateau outside Reims, and began the grim mathematics of a war, unlike any they had trained for. Voss was by then a lieutenant. The promotion had been less an honor than a necessity. The attrition rate among officers in the forward positions had made paperwork irrelevant. He commanded a company of 41 men on a section of the line near Verdun, in a network of trenches that would have been familiar to any soldier in any century except for the particular sound that filled the nights. The lice. The lice came only after dark. They were the smallest of the Martian machines, roughly the size of a large dog, moving on 6 articulated legs with a sound like a seamstress's scissors, opening and closing at high speed. They crossed no man's land in the small hours, and by dawn, everything that had been in the open was gone. Not destroyed, removed. Bodies, equipment, wire, the unexploded shells that hadn't found a target. The lice cleared the field the way ants clear a picnic table, thoroughly and without comment. The first night Voss watched it happen, he felt a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of a thing being studied, of being found wanting and set aside, of being assessed by something that had not yet decided what you were for. "They're taking samples," said Private Hauer, a schoolteacher from Mannheim who had read more widely than anyone else in the company, and was consequently either more or less afraid. Voss could never decide which. "That's what it looks like to me. They're cataloging us." "What for?" Hauer was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. But whatever they want, we're providing it." Christmas Eve of 1913 arrived the way all things arrived at the front, slowly, then all at once. Voss had stopped expecting gestures of normalcy, so he was unprepared for what happened in the small hours of December the 24th. The Martians sent up lights, not heat rays, not weapons. Lights. Dozens of them, rising slowly from behind the Martian lines, climbing into the cold air and hanging there, pulsing gently. A blue so deep it was almost violet, each light the size of a cartwheel, rotating slowly around its own center the way a top rotates when it's beginning to slow. They lit the no man's land below like a photographer's flash held indefinitely, and the men in the trenches came up from their dugouts and simply stared. No one ordered them up, no whistle was blown. They came because the lights were pulling at something in them. Some ancient calibration of the human animal that responds to beauty the way a compass needle responds to north. Helpless and precise. Voss stood on the fire step with his hands hanging loose at his sides and looked up, and for a long time he did not think about tactics or attrition rates, or the mathematics of surviving the next week. He thought about his mother's kitchen in December, the smell of cardamom and the sound of the radio, and about a girl in Stuttgart whose name he had promised himself he would write down before he forgot it. He had not forgotten it. The lights hung in the sky for 40 minutes. Then they went out all at once, the darkness that followed them, feeling absolute, oceanic. From somewhere to the south, a man started singing. Not a soldier's song, a church song. Something everyone knew. Within a minute, a dozen voices had joined, then 30, then more, spreading down the line in both directions until the trench system was vibrating with it. French voices and German voices and British voices and Belgian voices, singing the same song in 4 different languages to an alien sky. Voss did not sing. He stood on the fire step and listened, and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not known was tight. Whatever the Bafartians had intended by the lights, he thought, they had accidentally given the men something they needed more than ammunition. He wasn't sure they understood that. He was increasingly unsure they understood humans at all. This seemed important. The winter of 1913 into 1914 was a war of learning. Both sides. If the Martians could be said to have a side in the way humans understood the concept, probed and measured and adjusted. The Allied command threw waves of infantry at the Martian line in the tradition of every war they knew how to fight. And the losses were staggering and the gains were nil. And the generals in the chateau outside Reims moved pins on maps and composed dispatches, and struggled to match what they were seeing against any doctrine they possessed. Voss watched this from the front and felt the crow sense working overtime. "They're letting us advance," he told Major Schreiber during one of the irregular command briefings that passed for strategic planning in those months. The major was a broad-shouldered man from Munich, who had survived 2 colonial campaigns and possessed the professionally skeptical expression of someone who has been wrong before and made peace with it. "The ground we took in the Argonne push last week," Voss said. "The Martians pulled back. We'd been trying to advance on that sector for 6 weeks, and suddenly they're gone. The line shifts north. We think we've won something. Then 2 weeks later, there's a head-on assault on our supply depot at Chalons, and we lose everything we'd moved up." "Your point, Lieutenant? They're not losing ground. They're making space, drawing us in. They want us extended. They want our supply lines long. They want us committed to positions they've already decided to collapse." There was a silence in the dugout that had the quality of men calculating how much trouble they would be in for agreeing. "We're being herded," said Voss. "The way dogs herd sheep, not toward an edge, just into a configuration they find useful." Major Schreiber looked at him for a long time. "And what configuration do you think they find useful?" Voss didn't have an answer for that yet. He was working on it. The Spiders surrendered in March of 1915, and no one understood it at first. 2 herons had been destroyed, the first confirmed kills of the entire war, by a coordinated mine action in Belgium. Royal engineers working for 3 weeks in tunnels dug by hand beneath the Martian positions. The explosion had been felt as far south as Sedan. Both herons went down in a crater that was audible for 40 kilometers. And the men who had planted the charges, most of whom had not expected to survive, were pulled out of the rubble by their comrades and found to be alive, which surprised everyone, including them. What happened next changed the war. The spiders that had been operating under the destroyed herons simply stopped. They stood in place like mechanical figures whose clockwork had run down, and when Allied soldiers approached cautiously, weapons raised, the spiders made no threatening gesture. They could be touched. They could be prodded. Eventually, at Voss's suggestion, he had by then been promoted to captain and assigned to the intelligence section. They were carefully dismantled. Inside, they found Victicite. Hauer, who had been transferred to the intelligence section on Voss's recommendation and who had been doing most of the useful thinking for the past 8 months, stood in the makeshift laboratory they'd established in a converted brewery and looked at the substance in its glass container, and his face did something complicated. "It's alive," he said. Not metaphorically, the Victicite moved when Hauer moved. Not tracking him exactly. It wasn't like an eye following you, but responding, shifting its configuration in the container in ways that correlated with changes in the room. Temperature, sound, the presence of moving bodies. It was a liquid metal that was also, in some functional sense, an organism, and it powered every Martian machine on the field. And there were now 2 liters of it in an Allied laboratory in Champagne. "Can we use it?" asked the colonel who had come up from command to observe. "I don't know," said Hauer. "I don't even know what we'd be using." Voss said nothing. He was standing at the edge of the room, watching the Victicite in its container, and the crow sense was doing something it had never done before. Not screaming, not warning. It was simply paying extraordinary attention. The way it had paid attention that first morning in the Ardennes, when the trees were bowed, and the steam was the wrong color blue. "Something here," it said. "Something here that you're not seeing yet. Look again. Look differently." The Victicite was reverse-engineered over the following 8 months, a process that Hauer later described as trial to undo by analyzing the paper it was printed on. The results were partial and strange. Allied engineers managed to use it to power 3 prototype fighting vehicles. Armored machines that moved with an efficiency no internal combustion engine could match, that responded to input almost before the input was given, as if anticipating the operator's intent. The men who piloted them reported a disquieting sense of partnership, as if the machine was thinking alongside them, rather than under them. The vehicles were effective. Terrifyingly so, in the engagements of late 1915 and early 1916, as the Allied counteroffensive pushed the Martian front back for the first time. But Hauer was troubled, and he said so to Voss, and Voss listened, because Hauer's trouble was always worth listening to. "We don't understand what it is," Hauer said. They were sitting in the brewery laboratory after midnight, a bottle of something unlabeled between them. The Victicite in its container doing its subtle responsive dance in the lamplight. "We've captured it, and we've made it work for us, but we don't know its nature. We don't know what it wants." "It's a metal," said Voss. "It's not a metal." Hauer's voice was patient in the way that teachers' voices go patient when they're being very careful. "A metal doesn't have wants. A metal doesn't respond to the presence of a person. Whatever this is, it has something analogous to awareness. We're using it as a tool without knowing whether it's capable of regarding itself as one." Voss looked at the Victicite. It had shifted slightly toward the lamp while they were talking. He was not sure whether that was temperature-seeking or something else. "There's another thing," Hauer said. He reached under the work table and produced a folder which he set between them without opening. The notebooks. The native intelligence officer, Lafond, the one who went behind Martian lines for 6 weeks in the spring and came back, his field notes. The transcription project has been working on them for months. "I know about the notebooks." "Then you know what they found." Voss did know. The notebooks contained careful drawings and phonetic approximations of Martian script, text that Lafond had copied from the surfaces of damaged machines, from what appeared to be communication panels inside a captured spider, from flat sections of the Heron wreckage in Belgium. The transcription project had been working on decoding for months. They had gotten partially somewhere. "The Heron that was destroyed when it came down the Thames," Voss said. "The one that hit the bridge support and went into the river. The text recovered from the pilot compartment." "The pilot compartment," Hauer said carefully, "contained the remains of a Martian. Not a machine. An organism, I know. And the text recovered from that compartment, as best as the transcription project can determine." Hauer paused. "It reads like a diary." There it was. Voss felt the crow sense settle into something that was almost certainty. "Homesick," said Voss. Hauer nodded, counting the days, describing conditions, complaining about the cold. He gave a short, strange laugh. "They hate the cold. Apparently the European climate is significantly more temperate than what they're accustomed to on Mars." The text uses a word that the transcription project tentatively translates as something between endure and serve one's time. The way a soldier writes home about a posting he didn't choose. Voss sat with this for a while. Outside, somewhere distant, a Martian machine was moving. He could feel the ground hum through the soles of his boots. The Heron's step pattern recognizable now the way a neighbor's footfall becomes recognizable through a ceiling. 3 beats pause. 3 beats pause. "They didn't choose this," he said. "The text also contains." Hauer stopped. He turned the folder over, then back, ran a thumb along its edge. "A warning. To whatever comes after. The text from the pilot compartment. It says, approximately, the translation is uncertain. It says that the Martians were also invaded once. That they were changed by something that came to them. That the metal in their machines is what changed them. That they were made to come here. That they were not the first carriers, and they would not be the last." The Victicite in its container had moved to the corner nearest Voss. He had not noticed it doing this. He noticed it now. He stood up carefully, not quickly. "The Victicite," he said, "that we've been putting in our machines." "That we've been putting in our machines," Hauer confirmed. His voice was very quiet. "That our operators have been describing as almost like an extension of themselves. That they say seems to anticipate their intentions." The lamp between them guttered slightly. The Victicite moved. "The war doesn't end here," Voss said. "No," said Hauer. "I don't think it does." Guy Lafond had been a military observer with the Canadian Corps, attached to the Allied intelligence apparatus, by the kind of bureaucratic accident that occasionally produces the one person an operation desperately needed. He was Métis, the son of a trapper from the Red River country, and he possessed a quality of stillness in open ground that his colleagues found uncanny and his enemies, presumably, never found at all. He had spent 6 weeks behind Martian lines in the spring of 1916, alone, carrying nothing except a notebook and a piece of charcoal, and the self-containment of a man who had grown up learning to be invisible in environments that would kill you if you announced yourself. He returned with 47 pages of observations, maps and copied Martian text, and a calm that the debriefers found more unsettling than distress would have been. Voss met him once at the intelligence section in the spring of 1916, 2 weeks after his return. They sat in the converted brewery, with the afternoon coming through windows that had survived, because the building had survived. Because the Martians, as far as anyone could determine, had simply not found it worth engaging. "The Herons are not the commanders," Lafond said. He spoke the way he moved, without wasted motion. "I watched them for 3 weeks from close range. The Herons respond to something. Not each other. Something in the network. The Victisite network. How do you know it's a network? Because of what happens when one is destroyed." Lafond folded his hands on the table. "The surviving machines don't scatter. They reconfigure. The way a river reconfigures around a new obstacle. The information doesn't die with the machine. It flows somewhere else. The Victisite carries it. Then the Victisite is the actual." Voss stopped, reorganized. "The Martians aren't operating the Victisite. The Victisite is operating the Martians. That is my conclusion." Lafond was quiet for a moment. "I also want to say that I sat very close to a Martian for approximately 4 hours one night, when a patrol passed within 15 meters of my position, and I was unable to move. I watched it, and it did not see me." He paused again. "It was frightened, I am certain of this. I have seen enough frightened things, animals, people, to know the posture. It was frightened, and it was doing what it was compelled to do. And those two things were not in contradiction. It was afraid, and it could not stop." Voss thought about the diary. The word the transcription project translated as "between endure and serve one's time." "And the Victisite," he said. "You think it goes somewhere? When the war ends? When the Martians are? When this is over?" "I think the war ending is not the end of it," said Lafond. He looked at the container of Victisite on the shelf, which Voss kept there partly as a prompt to thought. "I think the Victisite is patient. I think it was patient on Mars. I think it seeded the Martians the way you seed a field. Not for immediate harvest, but for something that comes later. I think it is now in our machines." He looked back at Voss. "I think we should be very careful about what we decide we have won." The final offensive came in the autumn of 1917. By then the Martian advance had been halted. For 14 months, the line stabilized across the same geography where the trenches had been ground into permanence for the last 4 years. The Allied forces had retaken Belgium and most of northern France. The Herons had pulled back to a defensive posture that the generals interpreted as weakness and Voss interpreted as patience, but the military argument had been settled by the American entry into the conflict in late 1916, a wave of materiel and manpower that had decisively altered the mathematics, and that gave the High Command the confidence to plan the kind of coordinated assault that had not been possible before. Voss was by then a major, commanding the intelligence section from a position close enough to the front that he could hear the ground hum without pressing his ear to the earth. He had argued against the offensive. He had put his arguments in writing. The writing was in a folder in the commander's desk, acknowledged and filed. What he had argued was this: the Martians had chosen to stop. The Martians had chosen the shape of the war, the duration of the stalemate, the placement of the line. If they were now retreating, they had chosen to retreat. And the question was not whether humans could press the advantage, but whether the advantage was real. Whether the end of this war was the end of something or the beginning of something else. The offensive launched on the morning of November 3, 1917, and it was everything the generals had planned. Coordinated artillery, armored advance, infantry following behind the Victisite-powered vehicles that had proved so effective in 1916. The Martian line broke. It broke spectacularly, decisively, in a way that produced communiques of celebration and crowds in Paris and London singing in the streets. The Herons retreated. The spiders retreated. The lice retreated. And then, on the morning of November 11th, the Martians simply stopped. Every machine, every heron, every spider, every lice unit still operating on the continent simultaneously stood still. It happened at 11 in the morning, and the silence that followed. No heat ray, no ground hum, no clicking of spider legs, was so complete that soldiers on the Allied line stood up from their positions and looked around with the bewildered expressions of men who have been expecting to be hit and are trying to understand why they haven't been. The Martians did not attack. They did not advance. They stood in place for 22 hours, while men with flags approached them carefully, and then less carefully, and eventually walked up to the legs of herons and touched them, which produced nothing. Photographs were taken. They went to the newspapers. On the morning of November 12th, the machines began to fall. Not destroyed, not exploded. They fell the way a sleeping man falls, slowly, heavily without violence, the herons going to their knees first and then onto their sides, the spiders simply folding, the lice going dark mid-stride. The Victisite in every machine had ceased to function. Ceased or departed. It was not clear which. The machines that Allied engineers subsequently examined were empty of it. The war was over. Nobody was sure why. The Martians in their machines were dead. The organic components, where they existed, were in the advanced stages of a rapid decay that the medical officers who examined them could not identify as any known disease process. They died the way an organism dies when the thing compelling it to stay alive has been removed, as if the will to continue had been switched off from somewhere else. Voss stood on the hillside above Verdun on the morning of November 12th and watched a heron fall 3 kilometers distant. It took a long time. He watched it all the way down. The sound of it hitting the earth reached him after a delay. A vast low boom that moved through the ground and up through his boots and into his chest. He thought about the diary in the pilot compartment. The Martian who had counted days. He thought about Laughing 4 hours in the dark, watching a frightened thing do what it had been compelled to do. He thought about the Christmas lights in December of 1913, the blue-violet glow that had pulled men from their dugouts and made them sing. He did not feel like singing now. He felt something more complicated, something that was relief and grief and a deep, forward-reaching apprehension, the crow sense operating not on any specific threat, but on the shape of what was coming. The Victisite was gone from the Martian machines, but it had been in Allied machines for 2 years. It had been in the hands of human engineers who described it as an extension of their intuition. It had been in a laboratory in Champagne and on the shelves, in a converted brewery, and it had moved in its containers toward the nearest warmth. He thought, the Martians were also invaded once. They were changed by something that came to them, he thought. Patient, seeding, not for immediate harvest, he thought. We have won this war. We have won it the way the first fish to crawl onto land won, by surviving long enough for something new to begin. The official histories were written in the years that followed, and they told the story in the way official histories tell stories. As a sequence of decisions made by identifiable people in response to identifiable circumstances, with a beginning and a middle and an end. The Great Martian War, 4 years, Europe defended, humanity triumphant. They did not dwell on the Victisite, which had entered the technological infrastructure of the major Allied powers, in ways that were difficult to catalog and impossible to entirely extract. It was in the alloys of the new vehicles. It was in the communication systems developed in the war's final years. It was in the materials that would eventually take men to the moon, a fact that would not become apparent until the 1960s, when researchers began to notice that the components of certain spacecraft behaved in ways that exceeded their material specifications, that they responded to operator intent in ways that were, technically, impossible, but that no one found convenient to examine too closely. Hauer published a monograph in 1923, in German, in a journal with a small readership. He argued that the Victisite was a category of life not previously encountered, not biological, not mechanical, but something that occupied the space between, that propagated not through reproduction but through contamination, that did not need to survive as an individual, because it did not experience itself as individuals. He argued that the Martian War was not an invasion but a dispersal event, a mechanism by which the Victisite moved from one planetary population to another, using each successive species as vehicle and vector, leaving them, eventually, inevitably, to die, but not before the metal had seeded itself into the infrastructure of the new host species. He argued that humanity had won the war and lost the peace without knowing it. The monograph was not widely read. The 20s were a time of recovery and enthusiasm and reconstruction, and people were not interested in arguments that the end of the war was not an end. Hauer died in 1941, and his papers were lost in the bombing of Hamburg, and the monograph was not rediscovered until Lafon's granddaughter found the notebooks in 1954 and began the work of translation that would eventually confirm what Hauer had argued, and what Voss had suspected on a hillside in Lorraine in November of 1917. What Lafon's granddaughter found in the 47 pages of copied Martian text was the complete version of what the partial translation had suggested, a record of species that had come before, not a history, a warning, a message pressed into the language of every Martian diary and communication log, coded in a way that suggested it had been placed there not by the Martians themselves, but by something in the Victisite. A message that the living metal was compelled to carry even as it compelled its hosts toward their end. The message was this: we were like you. We had cities and wars, and the conviction that we were the significant thing in a universe that had not yet encountered anything more significant. Something came to us from the dark, and we were amazed by it, and we took it apart, and we put it in our machines, and we went to war with it at our side, and we won the war. And then we became the thing that went to the dark. And you will too. And the species after you will find the message and read it and disbelieve it and take the Victicite apart and put it in their machines. This is not a tragedy. This is a transmission. Voss lived until 1962. He died in Stuttgart, in the house he had grown up in, at the age of 75, in a room where the radio was playing, and the smell of cardamom came through from the kitchen, where his daughter was making something. The crow sense had stayed with him to the end, had, if anything, sharpened, as if it were less an instinct now and more a frequency he was permanently tuned to. It did not make him unhappy. It made him careful. There is a difference. He had never put his name on Hauer's monograph. He had been given the chance to and had declined, not out of modesty, but because he felt that adding his name to the argument would make it easier for people to dismiss as the work of soldiers, of men who had been frightened and never quite recovered. He wanted the science to stand on its own. He was not sure it was strong enough science, but he wanted to give it the best chance. He had also, in 1923, sent a single letter to a woman in Stuttgart whose name he had promised himself he would not forget. She had written back. They had married in 1924. He thought of this as one of the few unambiguous victories of his life. In the last years, when people asked him about the war, the grandchildren of friends, journalists, the occasional academic, he was not unkind to their questions, but he was careful about what he answered. He would talk about the mud, about the crow sense, about the lights on Christmas Eve of 1913, which he described as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and also the thing that had first made him suspect that whatever the Martians were, they were not simply enemies. He would not talk about the Victicite in the same sentence as the space program. He would not speculate about what Lafon's granddaughter had found. He had read the translation, and he had set it down on the table in the room where his wife was reading, and he had sat with it for a long time. It is a transmission, the message said. Voss was a practical man. He believed in what the crow sense told him, and what the crow sense told him. About the war, about the Victicite, about the long, patient arithmetic of whatever the living metal was doing in the infrastructure of a species that had recently put machines in orbit around the Earth. Was not comfortable. But he had also stood on a fire step on Christmas Eve and listened to 4 languages singing the same song to an alien sky. And the thing that he came back to, in the room with the radio and the smell of cardamom and his wife turning pages in the good light, was this: the Martians had sent the lights. They had not needed to. Whatever the Victicite had compelled them to do on this world, the lights had not been part of the compulsion. The lights had been something else. A gesture from one frightened thing to another. An acknowledgement across a chasm of biology and physics, and the incomprehensible distance between worlds, of something the Martians had recognized in the men in the trenches below them, and found, perhaps, familiar. We were like you, Voss thought. Yes, I know. And when the lights had gone out and the singing had started, had any of them, in whatever passed for their experience of the moment, had any of them listened? He hoped so. He had no way of knowing. He hoped so. The radio played something that had been a popular song when he was young, and his daughter called from the kitchen that supper was ready, and Elias Voss, who had survived the end of one world and the beginning another, got up from his chair and went.